Another couple of places you can get yourself in trouble with the bounding box are the roto node and the merge node. So let's look at example cases of where you could inadvertently grow the bounding box to be much larger than you anticipated. So I'm going to reformat this just to cut off the ladybug outside here, and by using reformat and preserve bounding box, I'm able to keep the bounding box of the ladybug outside the format. This is really useful in cases, for example, if you needed to add a shake or a filter that would have to pull in pixels from outside. Because the bounding box is still preserved, I can move the ladybug back in and I will not lose any data. So this is a good thing, this behavior, but if you're not careful with how you use it, this bounding box can grow substantially larger. Let's look at an example with the roto node. So the ladybug is up along the top of the frame here. And let's say that I wanted to use a roto node to color correct the ladybug. So I've dropped down a roto node, and I'm going to start dragging out a shape and soft shape to color correct. Now you notice that the size of the bounding box has grown as the roto has been added in. This wouldn't be problematic except for, let's say that I continue to animate the ladybug forward and simply animate the roto like this. The bounding box has continued to grow. So by not being very careful about how I'm using it, I've grown the bounding box for no really good reason. If we go into the roto node, we can see we have the choice of how we want to clip the bounding box. So I could say to the original bounding box, which would still give me the output of the roto node, but would clip it to the incoming bounding box. Or I could clip it to the union or the intersection. In this case, the intersection really to B box is the best because I want to keep this area outside. So when you're using the roto node, it's best to be very cautious about how you choose to clip your bounding box, and to always pick the most efficient clip to mode for your given context, which is not always going to be the default mode, as we saw. Another example where you can get yourself in trouble is with the merge node. So in this case, we have this scene where we had to replace the name of this bank and make it look like a casino. And as you can see, you can track this, but then it goes off screen and it moves. So this has been tracked, and then the casino name has been put over it. But as it goes out of frame, it makes the bounding box grow larger and larger and larger due to this overnode here. All of the match move is working as we'd expected. It never makes the format grow of that. It stays within its own format and even shrinks the bounding box to be quite small. But when we do the merge, it progressively continues to grow the bounding box until the bounding box for the frame gets nearly as big as the original frame, nearly doubles the size of the frame. The over node has the choice of how to set the bounding box as well. So by simply choosing the correct bounding box mode here, let's say we set it to the incoming bounding box, which in this case would be B. That's the one we want to keep. It will not grow the bounding box larger and larger and larger. It will keep it at the size of the B bounding box, which was the background image, and then we'll get a nice efficient use of the bounding box downstream of the overnode. So the moral of the story here is, if you see your bounding box growing to be ridiculously large, which is very easy to do in many cases, you can do it very simply, even just using a transform node, if you use the transform to grow an image, it will grow the bounding box. Make sure that you're only tracking pixels that are necessary for what you think you're going to have to do. And if you have to do a crop, or you have to do or you have to adjust the default bounding box behavior for a particular node to redefine your bounding box to keep it efficient, then make sure you do that. There's one other case that needs to be mentioned, which is in situations like this where the image has grown larger than the format, or the bounding box has grown larger than the format. Sometimes this is a desired behavior because, for example, you will want those pixels that are being defined outside of the frame in cases like a blur. So let me show you a quick example here of a blur. If I took this image and blurred it, it is pulling in the pixels that were outside the frame into the blur, which is what we want, right? We don't really want to have it pulling in maybe black or undefined pixels outside the frame. But if you're not careful, I'm going to intentionally crop the image here, and I'm going to reformat it, or say black outside rather. Now what's happening is it's putting a black pixel when I check black outside and crop it, even though it's redefined the bounding box to be the size of the frame downstream of the crop. When I check black outside, what it has done is put a black pixel just outside the boundary of the frame, rather than keeping the color of the pixels that were there to begin with just outside the frame or at the very edge of frame. So when I do my blur with black outside, it's now pulling in that black pixel into that final blur result, which is oftentimes not really the result that you desire. Occasionally you'll run into a situation where you must crop the image and keep the pixels that are outside or along the edge. And you'll know these situations when you see them. It's similar to what we saw when we set black outside in the crop. The filter or operation you do will be pulling in pixels from outside the frame or the edges of frame, and it will create a result that's not really what you would like. So let's look at what I'm talking about here just by dropping down a crop node and cropping the format to be smaller, or the crop region, the bounding box, to be smaller. If I turn off black outside, you'll see that what Nuke does is repeat the pixels at the very edge on out through this undefined area, or the area outside the bounding box. Its assumption is that everything outside this area you would like to have extend on forever. And the reason for that, again, is if you drop down something like a blur, it's going to want to blur those edge pixels, rather than if you set black outside, it will potentially pull those black images in. So you have these two different behaviors that you should really be looking out for, so you get the result that you expect rather than some unexpected result, or that you know how to debug it and adjust things correctly to get the result you desire. This edge repeating thing can be a real surprise if you've never seen it before, but this is the correct behavior. Nuke is doing what it normally would do when you do not set black outside like this.